Islamic jurisprudence on women's rights and Muslim minorities. She has over 20 years of experience working with various Muslim community organisations across Australia in the areas of Islamic education, capacity building and Muslim women's advocacy. She is co-chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, and she is a mother of 4 mashallah children. Quite an accomplished young lady, mashallah, and an expert on the topic we're going to talk about tonight. I've got with me on my left Sister Mona Almi. Sister Mona is a PhD candidate in the Department of Arabic Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney, researching the English translation of the verses of women from a feminist perspective. She was awarded the Master of Philosophy with distinction from the University of Sydney. Her thesis focused on the English translation of the verses of war by Muhammad Abdul Halim. This lady doesn't shy away from controversy, mashallah. She is adjunct lecturer in Arabic language at the Centre for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. Her research interests cover the fields of Quranic studies, translation, Arabic teaching, sociolinguistics and gender studies. She is an enthusiastic and influential leader of ISRA and has a passion in community service. She was amongst the organising panel of the Charles Sturt University and Western Sydney University Islamic Studies. Welcome, ladies. Please make them feel welcome. Thank you. The topic for tonight is gender, broadly described as gender, but specifically we're going to be talking about what is colloquially referred to as the beating verse. Makes us all a little bit uncomfortable. I want to note that the views expressed tonight will be each individual's. These are not easy topics, but I think we're all here in the vein of discussion and understanding and education. So it's a safe space in terms of questions, but also I think we have to be lenient with our panelists. It's not an easy topic to address. So we will have time for Q&A at the end after the break. But during the discussion, inshallah, my goal is to facilitate a conversation in the hope that we all gain a little bit more insight into these topics. I'll get started. What I might do is, the verse we're talking about specifically is Surah An-Nisa, ayah 34. So, Sister Mona, if you don't mind reciting the verse for us so we can hear the Arabic.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم فالصالحات قانتات حافظات للغيب بما حفظ الله والتي تخافون نشوزهن فعظوهن واهجروهن في المضاجع واضربوهن فإن أطعنكم فلا تبغوا عليهن سبيلا إن الله كان عليا كبيرا.
Thank you, Sister Mona. I might just recite the English translation. And what I'm hoping to do is, where the words are slightly controversial, I'll just say the Arabic because I don't want to put an interpretation on it, and we'll go to our experts to understand what they mean. So the recitation, the translation I've used is the Yusuf Ali one. Men are the qawamun of women because God has given the one more strength than the other, and because they support them from their means. Therefore the righteous women are qanitat, and guard in the husband's absence what God would have them guard. As to those women on whose part you fear nushuz, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last Daraba. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for God is most high, great, above you all. Quite a hefty verse. We've got quite a few terms in there, Sister Mona and An-Nisa, that are difficult to grapple with. I might start with you, Sister Mona. I guess the first part of this is this concept of qawamun. Men are the qawamun of women. Can you tell us what is the linguistic interpretation or differences in understanding that term?
So, qawamun, the root word of qawamun comes from the verb qama أو يقوم, which means to stand or to stand to do something. We look at, however, in the context of this verse, qawamuna comes, classical, modern, contemporary commentators interpret it and translate it as, some of them say it's protector, take full care of, some say it's maintainer, responsible. So there's different interpretations for that across time throughout the interpretation of the Qur'an.
And can you unpack that a little bit further in terms of, is there a difference between, for example, the traditional interpretations versus more modern interpretations of the term?
There is a difference. And there is a bit of a problem as well that sometimes when we go to the interpretation or the translation, we go word by word. But when you do the research or when you want to look further into that verse, you see that those whether traditional or modern commentators or translators, they actually elaborate on that particular word that they've translated it. So that gives you a more insight of it. So if you go, for example, At-Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Jalalain, they all agreed to have the same sort of qawamuna, as in the protector. Mm-hmm. Or the one that is, or if you go to the whole context of the thing, has some kind of superiority as the man. But then there's obviously the continuation of the verse, which shows you that there's conditions, right? Whereas the moderns, and then if you go further to research into what they mean, for example, Ibn Kathir says maintainer or protector, and they still give it that connotation of superiority. Whereas in the modern or more contemporary, for example, you have Sayyid Qutb, you have Muhammad al-Ghazali, the contemporary Muhammad al-Ghazali, Ibn Ashur, they more give it they explain it further, and they give it more of being care. And we go further, there's more contemporary and modern translators that say that this is not referred to males at all. And we can go in further and explain it later.
Yeah. Just to clarify, in terms of this verse, and An-Nisa, maybe you can tell us, I guess when it refers to men and women, we're talking generally about men and women. And we have relationships with our fathers, we have relationships with our brothers. Is there a particular relationship context for this verse?
Actually, it's interesting you mentioned the context, because just before this verse was revealed, there was a previous verse that talked about that when you receive chastisement, you should chastise in kind. And so there was an example of a husband of one of the Ansar of Medina, and he hit his wife. And now the women of Medina are known to be quite headstrong, quite forthright, whereas the women of Mecca under the Quraysh tended to be follow a certain sort of role of being a bit more subservient. So when the early Muslims migrated to Medina, they picked up on some of the way in which Medinian women have behaved. And so when this man of the Ansar hit his wife, she was very shocked and affronted, and went to the Prophet and said, well, how can this happen? He hit me, and she was accompanied by her father, and her father said, surely we should have the right to reply, he can't just treat my daughter like this. And the Prophet was in the process of agreeing with the wife and saying, yeah, and then the verse was revealed. And after the verse was revealed, there's lots of traditions that say that the Prophet claimed, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we wished for something and Allah wished for something else. And there are a lot of interpretations and discussion about what that means. And that has led to quite a lot of discussion, obviously, amongst not only the mufassirin, the people who are, the exegetical scholars looking at the meaning of the verse, but also what that impact that has in terms of a verse of the Qur'an and the prophetic response to it. Because if we look at the example of the Prophet in his life, he never once laid a hand on his wives. And he was very assertive in saying, do not hit your wives. There are those among you who hit their wives, but they are the worst of mankind. So he in his own example as a prophet, as the living, walking Qur'an, he never ever took it upon himself to discipline his wives. He did do the keep away, and he did take time away from them, but he never ever got to that stage where it said you can discipline them physically, you can hit them.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of different interpretations, and like Mona said, there are more female scholars who are now starting to do their analysis of the Qur'an, their analysis of the Quranic Arabic. And for example, there's 2 other mentions in the Qur'an of the word qawamun, and it's only in that verse 434 that it refers to a husband being qawamun ala his wife. The others are saying, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu kunu qawwamuna lillahi shuhada bil qist. So it's talking to all believers. So those are the 2 verses, which are the verses 5:8 and the verse 4:135. They don't actually distinguish that qawwamun is specifically just husbands over wives. It's qawwamun, stand up, like iqamat salat, like you said, from the word qama. It has so many different meanings, and in this case it means stand up, stand firm, rise up, speak out against. So if we look at it in terms of a Quranic sort of, linguistics as a whole, that is only one example of what qawamun means, whereas in the other 2 examples, it's talking to all believers. So in that sense, it's not an indication of only, referring to husbands being superior over their wives.
It's interesting you say that, because in terms of this concept of even superiority, I was looking at translations today of qawamun, and I actually didn't come across one that said interpreted qawamun as superior. The ones I got were protectors and maintainers, which is the use of Ali one, in charge, which is the closest probably to superiority, and there was another one that was take full care.
Excuse me.
You're okay. So you're right. Yeah. So in terms of those sort of explanations, where does this idea of superiority come into it? Is it in the in charge translation, do you think?
I think, based on the research that I've done so far, whether academic research or it's what I've seen around me, different Muslim communities, it's cultural input. It's really cultural input. So if we look at, and to be a bit more fair as well, that you have classical interpretation of the commentators. They focus when they use the methodology of interpretation. So the methodology of interpretation, modern and classical, are using one methodology, but then there's difference coming in here and there. Well, the one is first interpreting the Qur'an bil Qur'an. What I mean by that is that using one verse to interpret another verse. So just what An-Nisa just said, so if this word means this here, how come it doesn't mean the same in the other verse? And this is where comparison comes, and this is where you can analyze and it's open up for more interpretation. And then interpretation al-Qur'an bis Sunnah. What An-Nisa said, and that's what, when you go back to the life stories of the Prophet, you refer to the ancestors, to the companions, the Sahaba, and you see, did this happen at that time? How close is this interpretation to our understanding of the Prophet's behavior? And then comes the competence in language, which is the linguistic aspect, and this is where the interpreter or commentator or translator has to be competent in the Arabic language, because they have to understand little bits and pieces. We have synonyms in the Quran, we have ambiguity, we have lots of Arabic grammar that is not translatable, or words. So for example, you have the word taqwa. Taqwa is a gender neutral word. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, akramakum indallahi atqakum. He doesn't say a woman or a man is the person, akramakum indallah is the man, or akramakum indallah. So the most honored by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that one that has taqwa. Taqwa can be a pious person, righteous, honorable, can mean anything, but a word that fully encompasses that word in English, we can't find it. So this is where the word, the linguistic aspect comes. Across all interpreters, commentators, translators, they follow that. But the difference is that classical interpretation or commentators, they focus more on textual interpretation.
Right.
And whereas the modern and more contemporary ones, they use the contextual. So they go further into what An-Nisa was saying, the reason of revelation, asbab al-nuzul, and then they go further into as well ijtihad. So there's also reason-based interpretation, whereas the classical interpreters, they more focus on textual-based interpretation. And they used to refuse reason-based. It's more contemporary, and starting from Sayyid Nursi, for example, he used that. Sayyid Qutb used it. Muhammad al-Ghazali, the contemporary one, they used reason-based, and then you have all the new translators as well. And this is ijtihad, and when we talk about ijtihad, it's not just the interference of a human mind. It's referring to scholarly texts, going further into research and analysis, and then basing your interpretation on your ideas or what you think came up. And obviously you have to be a scholar and you have to be competent in all those. Not anyone can just come and do ijtihad on the verse. And then there's more to it as well, where you can see that there is bias. We have to understand whether it's translation, interpretation, classical or modern. This is human work. So there is an interference of ideas and ideology in this translation. The only thing that is pure is the divine words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we also have the mutable verses and immutable verses as well. So tawheed, we cannot, this is what it is. We can't play around with it. But then you have those verses of law, verses that are there to lead us how to live and how to be living as a society. There's always new interpretations, and they're open for new interpretations as well.
I love that point you made, that there is definitely elements of bias in the person coming into it. And so when people approach these topics through the element of black and white, and they take a very literal or one approach, it can lead to rabbit holes, don't you think?
Yes, of course, because I sometimes get a bit, this is not male bashing or anything, this is a reality that we did have in the 13th century, 2nd century. We had a patriarchal society, and therefore it influenced the way our classical interpreters interpret these texts, or even the Qur'an. Even the text, you have Imam Ghazali, I'm a fan of him. I love him, and we can't degrade his work, but he lived in an era where it was so patriarchal. They disregard women at all in their fiqh, and then this is why, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam there. He sent it to a people where women were degraded, girls were buried alive, women were treated as slaves. So at that time, when the Qur'an and the verses came after verses, it was a really hard time for the Prophet to, in 21 years, to convince people about the rights of humans and then the rights of women. This is not something easy. But he was able to do that. And if you see after that, all these biases and patriarchal ideas, and they came way after. And a proof of that, if you see even our four Imam Hanafi, Hanbali, Ahmad, etc., if you see them, if you compare between the views, fiqh views of Imam al-Hanafi, you see them more lenient than the fiqh views of Imam Hanbali. Because Imam Hanafi was more closer to the time of the Prophet, whereas there's 161 years between Imam Hanafi and Imam Hanbali. So this is where the interference of patriarchal ideology started coming in and interfering in the text. And then also all our previous scholars, who I respect much, and their work, they were all males. So there was no female interference. It was very, very minimal. And if they were there, a lot of times their work wasn't even cited.
Right.
Because of the culture back then. It was either to protect them for security reasons, etc. So this social change that happened now, and we have Muslim women scholars that are actually, that want to, and you said Muslim women, there's even male scholars that are coming to revise these verses.
Absolutely, yeah.
I call them
not just really
I call them male women friendly translators.
Yeah.
Because they have offered, and it's fabulous what they've offered in a very sophisticated and very convincing way, where you can't say that this is wrong, because they followed the methodological approaches of tafsir, And this is just a continuous thing of our previous ancestors anyway. Michelle.
An-Nisa, I wanted to ask you in relation to what Mona was saying, what do you say to people that say that the Qur'an has a patriarchal language or speaks in patriarchal terms? How do you address that in light of this kind of verse and this concept of qawamun?
Yeah, I guess I would just, remind them that the Qur'an, you've got to take it as a whole text, and as a whole text, it was revealed to liberate people, to get rid of slavery, to help women to not be buried when they're babies, to award orphans their right, their ability to maintain their property. As you mentioned, women, the condition of women was awful. And so through the text and the revelation of the Qur'an over so many years, that it was a gradual process of trying to change those attitudes and trying to change that. And it has overwhelmingly a very egalitarian and liberating message. And as, for example, Asma Balas, who has done a lot of work on the Qur'an, she talks about how patriarchy has been read into the Qur'an, and that it is, like you said, it is a product of these translations and these commentaries, and because they don't ever just translate it, they always have lots of notes, and sometimes they even refer to previous books from the Torah or the Injil and the Psalms and all kinds of the Bible, to be able to fill in bits that they perhaps is not clear. So they have their own choice of how they understand and elaborate on all these verses. And if you have a look at lots of the words, you sort of talk about anfusakum, you talk about looking at nafs, you talk about, like you mentioned with taqwa. So there are so many terms, and ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, all of you who are believers, addressing both men and women, addressing them, encouraging them to justice, encouraging them to righteousness, to piety, to good deeds. Those who do good deeds, and they will be granted Jannah. So we do have these select verses that stand out, and that for whatever reason, it's something that's a duty upon us to continuously try to understand what is the message of the Qur'an, and looking at it as a whole, and looking at it in terms of what was the example of the Prophet ﷺ, and how did this try to gradually inform change. So there's a scholar, Tahir al-Haddad, from Tunisia, who he talks about this siyasa at-tadrijiyya, which is the policy of gradualism, where obviously there was slavery rife at the time of the Prophet, and the Qur'an talks about slavery. But just because it exists in the Qur'an and that it's mentioned, does that mean that it means that it's supposed to exist today? No, we look at a lot of Muslim countries today, they have eventually abolished slavery. They've agreed that it's something that does not represent the dignity of a human being, which is what the Qur'an is all about, which is what the Prophet's last sermon was about. No black man is above a white man, no white man is above a black man. Take care of your women, they are, and then in the Qur'an, they are your garments. There are so many references talking about being kind and compassionate and merciful. And yet, however, it is something, if it's just mentioned there, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily, so a lot of Quranic commentators say that these verses are descriptive, but they're not necessarily prescriptive, which means that just because it is mentioning an event or a social norm that happens at the time doesn't mean that it's something to be continued for all time.
It's not prescribed.
Exactly. It's not something that Allah says, okay, we talk about ma malakat aymanukum, we talk about concubines, we talk about this, talk about that. No, the whole idea of the Prophet and his example and the Qur'an was to, get rid of slavery. That gradualism was to gradually, slowly get rid of slavery, free them. If you break an oath, you free a slave. If you, free a slave, you get this much reward. If you are unable to make up your fast, to free a slave. There's all these opportunities and encouragement to try and break down these examples. And so the Qur'an, in that sense, is only patriarchal if it has been read into it, as you mentioned, if it has the eye and the lens and the context of those who are reading into it, who are interpreting it, who are trying to make sense of it for the people of their time. But of course they're influenced by their time. So now we come to the 20th century where we are obviously influenced by lots of new concepts, of ethical concepts, of moral concepts. And this is something that we as human beings need to consider. And like I said, slavery was rife, but now most Muslim countries, you know, the latest was 2007 with Mauritania. That's still quite recent, but way back, you know, probably from the late 1800s, you know, Muslim countries said, yeah, that's right, we shouldn't be having this. That doesn't obviously mean that it doesn't exist today. We do know that modern slavery exists in many forms. We know about the Uyghurs in occupied East Turkestan. We know about the migrant workers in Dubai, and we know about the migrant workers in, you know, across the UAE and in places like Saudi Arabia, and all the different forms of modern slavery that take place, about women being trafficked. So it happens. And also, unfortunately, with groups like ISIS, who claim that they have religious sanction to take slaves and concubines again. So but as a community, as a society, as a global, you know, collection of Muslims, we realise that these notions are outdated. And so therefore we're trying to move beyond these concepts that are mentioned in the Qur'an, because we know that this is not what the Qur'an what Allah meant for continue for all time.
It's not the Qur'an that you're saying is outdated, it's these patriarchal interpretations, or the lens through which we're reading the Qur'an is outdated. Yeah. And so I guess that gives us a lot of room to move in the discussion as well. If we were to take, for example, for this qawamun concept, if we were to take the definition or the translation of Yusuf Ali saying that men are the protectors and maintainers of women, you know, in the modern context, women would say, well, why do I need protection? Why do I need to be maintained? What do you say to something like that, if that was raised?
I would say that the immutability of the Qur'an, the ijaz that is in the Qur'an, is the reason that the Qur'an serves for past, present and future. Because it allows successive generations to search in the Qur'an, to search in the meaning based on the time they're living in, based on their country they're living in, the place they're living in, and to come up with fresh knowledge. And this is what's happening with the rise of Muslim women scholars. I do say that it is a reason, they don't have to be feminist, but it is that now we're living in a context where there is a huge movement of feminist movements. And if you go back to the controversial verses, the verses of war were controversial when Islam became a violent religion and Muslims became terrorists. So you see where verses
not literally, but you mean assumed or perceived. Yes.
Assumed. That's why they're controversial. So if we look at it, let's say 30 years later, when women have their rights, that's how I look at it. What's controversial now? The verses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts responsibility on the man to take care of a woman. So it's more about, you know, the culture, but and the time we're living in. That
could that be also why the interpretation could be diverse, and it's not one thing, it could be one thing for one time? Maybe could that be the intention, in that, I mean, throughout history we know there are periods where women would not be safe. Even today in many countries of the world, they couldn't leave their homes.
That's right.
So in those countries then men would be required to protect the women.
Yes.
So could it be that it is open? Because you sometimes wonder, you're like, why isn't it clear cut? You know, a lot of people say, where's the answer? Why is it so ambiguous? Could it be that it's been left open to interpretation so that it can facilitate for every time and every context?
And I guess some of the early, like you mentioned, some of the early commentators, they talked about this notion of superiority, even though it's not technically translated as superiority, but that notion of faddala is translated and understood as establishing that kind of hierarchy between over men and women. But then successive commentators talked about, okay, in what sense? Because they say, for example, Muhammad Abdul talks about, just after that is bima faddala ba'duhum ala ba'd, which means the favors Allah has given one over the other, but doesn't say the favors that Allah has given man over woman. So from that sense, then he says, look, maybe just at that time, men were given, like, as you know, women were probably didn't, you know, were surviving for their lives, didn't have the opportunity, apart from notable examples like Khadija radiallahu anha, who was a businesswoman in her own right. But a lot of them were very economically reliant on men, and so at that time, that some of the commentators say, well, this can be taken to mean that they have only economic faddala, economic caretaking of women. And as you mentioned, then that as consecutive commentators have come across, they say, well, for example, like Fazlur Rahman, who's a prominent Pakistani scholar, and he talks about, well, does this mean that men have, economic right, and in return that sense of obedience for all time? Or is it that when, for example, women start becoming more economically independent, do they then lose, do men lose that right of fadala? And it's interesting, like Amina Wadud, for example, talks about the situation of Black African American Muslims. So their shared lineage is of slavery. And even when slavery, obviously under slavery, men and women had no right to earn anything. They were basically they had no money, no income. And so men could not be protectors or maintainers of their women. And then when slavery was gradually abolished, so in America, but even when slavery was gradually abolished, women were the ones who were chosen and had chance to earn money, because men were considered to be a threat. They were considered to be, that they were trying to rise up against the white system that had captured them and enslaved them. So for many years, women were the ones who were the caretakers and the providers for their families. And so she talks about this as, well, what does that mean then? Like how sometimes the lived reality that Muslims face are not something that is reflected in the Quranic text. So obviously the message there, it needs to be reinterpreted. But she talks about how that, going on later on, I know we're going to go into the later part of the verse, but she says that when there's situations like this where, for example, when the African American communities did become Muslim and they somehow held on to this romanticized notion of the man as the breadwinner, the man as the caretaker, because for so many years they couldn't have that. And then inevitably, when women were the ones who were getting the jobs, it clashed with their concept of, well, this is what Islam is supposed to do, and I'm Muslim, I'm supposed to do this for my wife, and now she's the one earning. And so it challenged their sense of masculinity, it challenged their sense of identity, and then inevitably it caused them to lash out. And who do they lash out at? Their wives. So in a sense, it kind of, the verse is talking about women who are nushuz, women who are being disobedient, or but in this instance, the women were actually doing the right thing and supporting their families, but because of the lived reality, and that doesn't always reflect, that's one lived reality of the context of the verse. And then you have another lived reality that takes place throughout all of history. So the scholars are talking about this. How do we make sense of this? How do we ensure justice and fairness for all when you have so many different lived realities? And so how can we understand this and try to enhance and create this sense of a just society?
Because these gender roles are actually social constructed. If we look at the Qur'an, and specifically this verse, Surah An-Nisa, verse 34, there's a reason, there's a context for this. As you said, there's a context for this verse. If you look at the general sense of, we're looking at the marriage between husband and wife and these gender roles. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَعَلْنَا بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. There's mercy, there's love. There's nothing such thing as you do the dishes and I'll do the beds, or you work outside, you're the breadwinner, I am. Because this is all human constructed. One day your husband can't go out and work, you go out and work. One day you're too sick to do the house cleaning, he can get up and do it. That's the mawadda and rahmah. It's that's where we come later into nushuz and into obedient wives and all. It's not about this is general. If we go to other verses in the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 19, 20, 21, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the man as well, because the at the time those verses were revealed, it was revealed because men at that time were mistreating women. So if we look at verse by verse and segment by segment, there's always asbab al-nuzul, reasons of revelation. There's the context of the verse it was come through, but we look at the general understanding and the divine message of the Quran. It's all about rahmah. it's all about, and it's not about punishment. Like there's lots of punishments in this verse, but really it's the context. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to us about the rahmah He has, the love He has towards us, before He talks about punishment. And then He says, if you don't do that, so there's lots of conditional language in the Qur'an. For example, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل. The preposition here, حرف الجر, is used for condition. Which is with what you have more than them. So right. If you have the means of power, the means of money, the means of physical strength, then okay, you are better, then you can do that. But as you said, in this context, we have lots of women now that can provide to the house more than the husband.
So the condition you're saying is in an area that the man has more of something than the women or the woman, he utilizes that for the purposes of protection, maintenance, taking care of her.
Yes.
But if there isn't that sort of a disparity between the man and woman, then it doesn't necessarily apply, like you mentioned in the context that you mentioned.
Yes.
I'll use this as a segue to the other terms in this verse, because I think there are 4 terms in this verse that I struggled with, and I'm sure people do as well. The other one was this concept of, I think it was qanitat, is that the word? Mm-hmm. So, therefore, the righteous women are qanitat, and guard in the husband's absence what God would have them guard. Mm-hmm. Now, I found definitions of devoutly obedient, truly devout for that word. Can you tell me a little bit about, in the context of what we're talking about, oftentimes you hear that refers to being obedient to their husband. Is that what we're talking about here, or is there something more to it?
It's more to it. It's about being obedient. Being obedient, going back to taqwa, this is general. This is for man and for woman. Mm-hmm. So whether you're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-qanitat, it comes from qunut, and it first revealed to Sayyidina Maryam alayhi salam. Al-Qanita. So it's more about devoting your life to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Putting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala between you in every aspect you do. So al-qanitat, obviously, when you are here, it's came for the woman. Qanitat, in every aspect, the way she deals with her family, with her husband or kids, she fears Allah in everything she's doing.
Right.
So
it's a general term for
it's
devout.
A general, exactly.
Or virtuous
devout. Devout. And here again, I say it's controversial because it's practically about Muslim, but it's a human universal ethic to be, have morals in the way you treat your husband and your kids and the way you deal with your family. It's not like I work and I know my husband's struggling financially and I just go save my money and say, you're the breadwinner. Mm-hmm. So it's more about, it's morals. It's fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, again, mawadda and rahmah. Where does the rahmah come? It comes where you care that he's a hard worker. We should probably, just what's happening now. A lot of men and women are working side by side so they can buy house, pay rent, etc. So it's all about taqwa, which is a general thing.
Yeah. And An-Nisa, what do you think about this concept of being devout and obedient? Does the term obedience have connotations of submission or being submissive to the husband in this context? What do you think?
I'd say I agree with Muna in the sense that the majority of the verses that talk about being qanitat and so he's talking about being qanitat to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it's only basically this verse that so much of that construction of this hierarchical relationship where the husband is above the woman. And some commentators have taken it even further where they didn't just say, he's above the woman in economic sense, but they referred to this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where they, a nation will not prosper with a woman as their leader. And so he relinked this concept of qawamun as being not just qawamun in the family, but qawamun generally speaking of all men over all women. And so this has been sort of this ongoing, construction and support of, and it all stems from this particular verse. And this is why so many of the female commentators and female, scholars and, again, male as well, who are looking at equality and justice and fairness, say, look, this has been taken out of this concept of being qawamun in economic perspective and in qawamun, and in turn, the fiqh scholars and, they're all human beings. They have all been influenced by their own their own context, which has been very largely patriarchal over the ages, and they have still just fed back into this concept of this sort of hierarchy, where even in Quranic, they try to attribute Quranic cosmology to being like, Allah talks to the husband, and then the husband, communicates to the wife. But the Qur'an doesn't talk to just the man and say, man, husbands, men, you talk to your women. No, it says, al-mu'minina wal-mu'minat, al-muslimina wal-muslimat. And that was actually in response to one of the Prophet's wives, Salama, who was probably, a very, again, another, very feisty woman. It's like, how come all the verses are just addressing men? And then that verse came down. And after that, then there were more verses. And so she was like, okay, good, all right, this God is not just for men. Okay, this cares about women as well. And so, in the Qur'an, there are numerous verses addressing both men and women. Like I said, to do good deeds, to ensure, to fight for justice, to seek out knowledge, for both. And there's so many examples where this is the case, but yet it comes back, and for whatever reason, lots of academics and scholars have said, look, it probably why this is so fixated on constructing this family dynamic of this hierarchy is to help support men in their sense of self-worth, or but you look at the example of the Prophet, and he was never threatened by his wives. I mean, he had very active engagement and discussions with them, and they disagreed with him, and he disagreed with them, but they were able to resolve things, even to the extent where it was serious issues. He went away. He just went into seclusion. He said, I need time to just think about this and process it. And so there's no sort of, it has just been unfortunate that the concept of this hierarchical dynamic has persisted through time, through lots of not only the Quranic commentaries, but also hadiths. There are a lot of hadiths that tend to be quite anti-women. Even Aisha, she has, spoken out against, particularly Abu Huraira, about a lot of the hadiths that he mentioned, and it's documented. He said no, like he said, if you three things will break, a salat: a donkey, a dog, and a woman. She's like, no, I'm sleeping and he's praying in the house. I'm not breaking his salat. Where do you get this from? But it has just so happened that for whatever reason, the hadith compilers, or they have just prioritized and really focused on a lot of these anti-women hadiths, which again feed back into the commentary and the understanding of how the Qur'an. And so it's now taking time to unearth a lot of those disagreements, unearth Aisha's responses to these things and Salama's responses to these things, and we need to have this opportunity now for more women
who need to talk more.
Access, and who have access to scholarship and who have access to knowledge to be able to now reassess and reinterpret for today's time and place.
But not everyone has access to academic material, and not everyone knows, especially when women are put in a situation where they're under stress. For example, spiritually abused. We'll come back to domestic violence in the second half of this verse. But if we talk as spiritual abuse, the first part of it is being used to spiritually abuse women, and not just from their husbands or fathers, or even from actual mashaykh and imams. Women have been asking for a divorce, or saying, is this fair, this is what's happening, you have to be an obedient wife. Yeah, he's allowed to say you're not allowed to go to your parents' house, he's allowed to say this, allowed to say that. And unfortunately, at this time, our generation is very, very smart. They have access to internet, social media. They don't accept that. They want to know why. And some of them don't have access to this academic material. They are losing their deen. This is why courses like these are very important.
Well, this is why we're having the discussion tonight,
Yes.
because clearly these verses are open to abuse and serious abuse.
I had lots of sisters that were on the edge of losing their deen because they came back from the imam when they were getting their divorce, and he said it's all right about a lot of things. And then you had to supply some materials and say, no, look, read this. Allah is merciful. This is important for you to know. But if someone didn't have that access and didn't have that friend or didn't have someone to teach them,
you can get lost.
They can get lost.
Absolutely. I guess what you both highlighted quite clearly is that the answers are not easy to find. And this is part of the reason why we're having these discussions, because it's not a simple Google search. In fact, if you do that, you're probably going to land in the wrong place. So the discussion and I think ladies like yourselves doing the research and bringing it to the fore is really important. Look, I'm mindful of time, and I know everyone wants to get on to the other juicy and meaty bit of this discussion. I was going to ask about Nushuz, this concept of, as to those women on whose part you fear Nushuz, admonish them, and then the rest of it goes on. What's your understanding of Nushuz briefly, Mona?
Nushuz is also the opposite word to obedient.
Right.
So also it's a general term. A man could be an Nushuz, so it doesn't have to be that a woman only is a Nushuz or does something wrong. However, we have to say, and to give credit to our imams or our people that understand, our classical interpreters or commentators did give it a negative connotation, and they linked it to more of sexual disobedient sexually. So refusing her husband, being disobedient to the husband. So this is where things come, and then fiqh came and said whether it's halal or haram. We're not going to go into all that.
No.
But it literally does have that broad sense of a disobedient wife.
Right.
Where, and some scholars, for example, say where she becomes financially, she's liable and everything. She becomes using her ego against her family and her husband, and that's where she became becomes nashiza. So she neglects her family.
Yep. So the ones that I looked at said ill conduct, disloyalty, and ill conduct.
Yep.
So ill conduct was the one for Yusuf Ali.
Yeah.
Arrogance was another interpretation.
Yeah, that's
rebellion was another one. Ill will. An-Nisa, any comments on Nushuz?
Well, just to mention that it's only mentioned one other time in the Qur'an, which is in verse 4:128, and this one time it's referring to men.
Right.
It says, if a wife fears nushuz or rejection from her husband, there's no blame on them if they settle on a settlement, and such settlement is best even though people's souls are swayed by greed. So even though the Qur'an seems to say a Nashiz woman, gets all these kind of actions that happen to her, which, it doesn't seem very well. A husband can also be considered Nashiz as well, but it's understood in terms of there's some kind of a settlement that takes place.
Right.
What it is, we don't know. It could be an economic settlement, it could be all kinds of things, but the Qur'an does refer to both of them as being able to constitute nushuz. But as you say, the fiqh scholars and everything just overwhelmingly look at how a woman can be nashiz.
Can I just add to that? In terms of male, if we realize the Qur'an, the psychological aspects or psychology, we're only like in the beginning of science, psychology, in the beginning of the 20th century. The Qur'an looks at psychology, it's embedded in it. So when you're talking about nushuz in males, because of the mental strength the male has, it's more about settlement in a broader sense. It can be outside the family. But if you always look at the settlement, and in particular this verse 34, the settlement when it comes to women, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always considers the emotions the woman has, and it's always more within the family and in the home, and between the husband and wife or between the family. So these are and I can elaborate further when we go into beating.
Let's go into that, because I guess that does take us into, well, if you see or you fear nushuz on the part, and this is specifically to women in this context, it says admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last, Daraba. So how do we understand now linguistically this concept of Daraba?
How do we're going to jump straight to Daraba?
Let's go into it.
Okay. So the actual word Daraba, if we go back to the linguistic aspect of it, it comes from Daraba yadrubu. And the word Daraba yadrubu in the Arabic dictionary, Arabic, not just the Qur'an, it has about 26 synonyms, 26 different meanings. And subhanallah, the commentators chose one, which is darab, which is beat them. Now, if you go further, if you have Ibn Kathir, you have Jalalain, Tabari, then you have all the commentators, they say beat them when they come to adrubuhunna, beat them. But some of them then elaborate and say beat them slightly. Some of them elaborate and say this is just a form of punishment, but it's more likely that you don't punish, you don't get to that point because the Prophet ﷺ didn't do it and he refused it. So they elaborate on that. Whereas you have the modern and more contemporary translators that say we can choose, for example, Daraba in the Qur'an, if you translate the Qur'an for Qur'an, Daraba as to hit was never translated in the Qur'an as Daraba or idrubuhunna. There's other terms for it. Whereas in the Arabic language as well, Daraba could mean to...
Sorry, repeat that again, what you said.
So the word Daraba,
yes,
Daraba, it's when it's meaning as to hit in the Quran, another word, a synonym was used in other verses.
But not Daraba.
Not Daraba.
Right.
And Daraba, if we come back to this verse 34.
That's referring to physical hitting.
Physical
so you're saying
hitting.
In other verses of the Quran that
Yep.
make reference to physical
Hitting,
the word Daraba is not used.
Not used.
Right.
And then if we come back to this verse, the word Daraba can mean to go away. Daraba can mean to, this is where you say Daraba fil ardi, to go away, to migrate. And then you can have Darabaka ala. Daraba ala is used for sexual intercourse. And then you have heaps of other
set an example. Daraba ala, like
yes.
Allah set an example.
Example.
For you, or set
Daraba
forth,
mathal.
or-
Daraba
yeah.
mathala kaza. He gave this analogy, this example of. So there's heaps of examples, heaps of synonyms or meanings of this word. And you have contemporary translators or commentators that say, for example, you have Layla Bakhtiar, she chose go away. The third resort is to go away from them. And she says, go away because she goes back to the Arabic language, obviously. And she says, why don't I choose that? The Prophet ﷺ used to leave the place. And he's asked us all, women and men, that when you're angry or when you're upset, make wudu and just leave the place. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to experience any domestic unsettlement, he used to leave yatruk al-makan, used to leave the place. So this is more closer where she is saying, if I'm going to refer to the life story of the Prophet, the morals of the Prophet, the Arabic language, this is what it means. And then you have also Drama. He is also a translator. He's a current translator. His translation came out in 2018. And he says, no, the last resort should be, which Daraba takes it from Daraba ala, which be sexual intercourse, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the previous segment says wahjuruhunna fil madaji', as to leave the bed. We'll come back to this one. So, and he says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks for mawadda and rahma, and in the rahma, after you've left, if you come back to this intimacy, then there's more understanding and more you can come back to the harmony of the family.
So the last stage is to return. To
return, not to actually be, because if you're, some scholars say that this is very close, because if he's going to come and beat, then you've come to, there's no resort. The lady is going to feel humiliated, the wife, and then marriage is done. But there's mawadda, there's rahma. We want to bring it back and come back to a solution. And with intimacy, they can come back to a solution. This is what some scholars also sided with it. And coming back to the psychological aspects of it, a lot of, they say, وَهْجُرُهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ. It's not to leave them completely out of the room. Scholars say, and even classical scholars say, this is happening in the room. The wife should not be humiliated in front of her kids or anyone that's living with her. So this is happening between you and her. You sleep in the same bed, you turn your back on her, and she turns her back, just like what we call now silent treatment, and then it comes back. So it's just where everything is considered in the Qur'an, even the psychological aspects, because then it refers to the woman being very emotional, she doesn't want to feel humiliated in front of... but then again, this could be also a male thing as well. It's not just punishment of a woman. So we'll go into that further.
We will. So I guess with just the linguistic understanding of that word, you've given us a whole range of definitions. An-Nisa, do you want to add to that in terms of, I mean, the translations I looked at, I guess the other ones seem to be a little bit more different for the other terms. For this one, I found, I'll just read it. Sorry.
I guess I just wanted to add to what you mentioned, like Yusuf Ali's translation is kind of the most sort of well recognised and most prevalent translation, and even he puts that word lightly in there, which indicates that, and I think with further commentators and so on, and he's referred to them, they talk about this concept of it should be a symbolic act. But even then, even though he tries to stick to what he feels is still within that concept of the male-female obedience and subservience, that he believed that it still wasn't right to just have Daraba there as hitting, and so he put his own interpretation there of lightly, and so it shows that he had a bit of an issue with having that there, and he was conscious that when you translate into English, who are the people who are going to be reading in English? It is predominantly the non-Muslim world. And what, obviously that has attracted a lot of, criticism and consternation and lots of, attacks on the whole concept of Islam, and how this is a proof of how Islam is, derogatory towards women. And at that time, there were, the conditions were very bad towards women. But if you look at, again, the Qur'an as a whole, what was it intended to do? It intended to improve those conditions. And if you can put that little, like that little extra bracketed thing, then why not? Why can't other, examples, like to set forth an example, to give, why can't that be used instead? And this is why some of the more contemporary scholars are looking at that and saying, we should be able to put because this is what they interpreted, and we're going to present an alternative to interpretation.
Because it actually is the truth. Putting that lightly in brackets, it sounds more apologetic.
It does. I was going to say it's an interpretation
it's apologetic.
Of an interpretation.
But whereas we can do the work, and someone like Yusuf Ali, a scholar and competent in the language, coming up with a revised version of his own Qur'an. For example, Muhammad Abdul Halim once said that he had his first translation of the Qur'an in 2010, and he said once he was, they call it in Britain, the subway, the train station, and he was in the train, and he came to his mind that he's translated one verse, and he kept thinking about it and said, no, I have to do a new translation, because this verse is supposed to mean this way based on the Arabic language. So the same person, in a matter of 6 years, was able to revise his own translation based on what he's learnt throughout these 6 years and understands.
In terms of the actual translation largely being strike or hit or beat lightly, I mean, I looked at Sahih International, and it's written by women, translated by women, and it also had beat lightly. What do you think the impact is on women when verses are translated in this kind of way, and historically so as well? And what is that impact that we see in our communities on women?
As I said previously, spiritual abuse, justification of domestic violence, not having the right to get a divorce, unfortunately, and it does. And the most important to me is seeing young women or even older women losing their deen, because they grew up to understand in their own community that رجال قوامون على النساء, you have to be the obedient wife regardless what it is, you have to do this, you have to do that, and these misinterpretations of these verses and misunderstanding of these verses. So unfortunately.
What do you say to people who will say, look, these are our scholars you're talking about? Did they misinterpret? I mean, I know we've discussed it largely, but obviously people listening tonight, some people will be thinking these are the scholars that we've trusted, respected, who are knowledgeable, and we take our faith from these people. They've translated it like this. Why should we take some modern interpretation instead?
We still respect our great scholars. and we just add the modern interpretation, and the modern scholars are just adding these gaps. Even the four A'immas that came, our Imam Hanbali, Al-Hanafi, Ahmad, Al-Shafi'i, they all handed over and they said, we have put for you these legal systems, but they are open for you to add on to them. And you are free to add. And there has been a lot of successive scholars that came after, and they added to this fiqh, and we all know that. We shouldn't reject modern, or as I said, the Qur'an serves the future through that way, through research, through more insight into the verses as to why this was. We don't disregard our classical interpretation. They did great work for their time and for our time as well, because it's there. If it wasn't there, how would we know how to add onto it, what to add onto it?
What the gaps are,
What are the
example.
gaps? Okay, there's a gap here because this never happened in the 13th century, but it is happening now.
And yeah, I guess I just wanted to add there to just say that they were products of their time, and they produced, amazing scholarship for their time. But again, they were influenced by the social norms, the cultural norms, the political situation that were at the time. A lot of these scholars, they were, being given positions in government. And we know now that there's so many Muslim scholars today who can't speak out, publicly for fear of being jailed or executed. So who knows the kind of pressures that they were under. We know that there's lots of scholars today who cannot speak freely given the political situations that they face, basically just because they want to provide an alternative opinion. I mentioned earlier about slavery and about how Islamic law is not something that's fixed. The texts like the Qur'an and the hadith, they're our sources, but Islamic law is meant to be continued. It is meant to keep progressing. It's not static. And the more we understand and learn, and how we relate back, what was the maqasid of Sharia, what were the principles of the Sharia, what were the underlying elements that try to make that Allah tried to convey that we would practice in our daily lives. I talk about, for example, related to slavery is this concept of polygamy. It's definitely mentioned in the Qur'an, and again, it's another contentious verse for another day.
Yes.
But a lot of scholars today, and as reflected in Muslim countries and legal codes, they have restricted a man's ability to have polygamy. They've required that he shows that he can have financial support, that he has different houses. There's all these things in law, but also countries like Turkey and Tunisia have banned it outright.
Morocco.
And they look at another verse, which is that you will never be just. And so marry only one. So again, they're using the Qur'an to support certain notions, whereas previously, the previous scholars, for all the great work that they did, they would focus on one aspect of family relations, on one aspect of social relations and what is socially considered acceptable. Nowadays, slavery is not considered acceptable. And so in many contexts, also polygamy is considered that this is actually an injustice, the way it's practiced. The way it's not following the sunnah. People don't marry widows and orphans now. They marry younger, more, beautiful versions of their wives, or even worse, they may marry converts and take advantage of them. This is a serious issue for us today, and something that we don't talk about and that we really need to address is the abuse of these minorities in the Muslim community. And so if polygamy can be reinterpreted and can be made illegal in the sense that it is unjust, then how many other aspects of the Qur'an can we take to be, okay, in this situation, in this context, it is unjust, so it's better that we take this verse of the Qur'an and we say, okay, we're going to leave polygamy for now. It's an ongoing process of constantly looking at how it balances with the lived realities of Muslims.
We also have to understand, adding on, the verses of where we see as humans males are superior or favoured, whether in the inheritance verses, polygamy verses. We have to understand they're conditional as well. There's asbab al-nuzul, there's khusus in them. So they're
Context matters.
It matters. Okay, so we can't take it in, and this is where spiritual abuse comes as well, because the majority of us don't understand that. And then when a sheikh comes and tells you that, or someone, a family member tells you that, and then you understand this is divine. I have to say that this is true.
Unquestionable.
But even, exactly, and even just giving the haq or the rights to our classical scholars, who I respect so much, is that if we dig deep into their work, upon translating word by word, you go into the interpretation. They bring up the morals of the Prophet ﷺ, the life stories of the Prophet. They tell you that it is better if you don't apply that. And they do. There's beautiful. And it's only, the Quran at the end of the day is a mirror. It just reflects, when you read it, it reflects you. If you have that rahmah in you, that love, that mercy, then you can only see mercy in that verse. For you, even the punishment verses, they're full of rahmah for us. But if you have aggressive and anger and hatred, then that's what you're going to see in the Quran.
Just before wrapping up for the break, I want to ask you both, I mean, you've raised that, it's very refreshing to hear that there's no, there's a whole array of ways to look at this. The context matters, the linguistics matter, the society matters. What advice do you give to people who read these verses and they feel challenged in their faith? So if an individual reads it and they feel like, I mean, obviously you're both very learned, mashallah, and we're learning a lot tonight, but for those who are not so learned and who actually feel within themselves challenged, what advice do you give them?
Well, I guess I'd like to refer to Professor Khalid Abul Fadl, who talks about this. He says Muslims, at some point in their lives, hear things and see things that make them have this, what he calls a conscientious pause. It's like, it just does not fit. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit with what I understand as of Allah as being, Rahma, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. It doesn't fit with how I understand the Prophet as being kind and generous to all those who were vulnerable, to the poor, to the needy, to the slaves, to women, to children. This doesn't sit quite right. And so even though sometimes it does feel like it is a huge task, and like you said, people don't know where to go, where to look for. I think now there's a lot more opportunity, such as platforms like this, where we can go out and look for things, and if you hear something, pass it on. You don't know how that might change somebody's life. They may be in a situation where they're facing domestic violence and feel that they deserve it, but you've got to remind them that Allah is Ar-Rahman. He doesn't intend for anyone to suffer. How can this be something that's Islamic? And so giving them opportunities, and I think also collaborating. I think one of the things you mentioned, Morocco has been really at the forefront, and Tunisia as well, of so many legal changes. But that has only happened because of the collaboration that took place between the legal jurisdiction as well as women's activism and women's collectives, and that engagement, that discussion. You find other countries where the laws are created purely by men, and you can see that in their content and in the the type of legal rulings that exist. But where you have countries that are looking at justice and equality for all people, in not just men but men and women, and they feel that okay, we can overcome this idea that man always has to be superior and that he feels inferior if his wife gets more money than him, and that this idea of both being working towards a shared goal, and I think this is what you need. Even though we may be concerned about some of the things that some of the shuyukh might say, we need to collaborate with them and talk with them, and find those who, because there are many who do support these alternative interpretations, and there are many who do want to work for justice and work for fairness and create these wonderful examples of family as the cornerstone of the community, and then that leads on to a very harmonious community. So it's about you feel that, don't just dismiss it. You feel that is something in your fitrah that doesn't sit right. So go out, ask people, seek knowledge, find out, and alhamdulillah that there's so many other opportunities, and that you can.
And sometimes you might not find it in the immediate, like just parking it there and coming back to it over time.
And even just saying, hang on, I'm just not happy with this. Instead of going, I have to agree, I have to trust your inner, your inner voice, that sense that, okay, this does not seem right, and I'm going to keep working at it until I find somebody that can say something that fits with me and that, again, make sense, but also reminds me that I can actually be Muslim and have these views. It's not just that you're, feminist and westernized and anti-secular, like anti-Muslim and everything, or that you're Muslim and that you have to abide by all these concepts. There are so many different ways of looking at how men and women should engage with each other with respect in society.
Thank you. Mona, did you want to add anything to that in terms of those struggling? And we'll wrap up on that.
Yeah, I think this also, stems up from, I think it needs time. It needs generation after generation. And one of the things is when losing Iman, and that is when you're born as a Muslim, you just adapt things and you become immune to them and they happen. And when someone says something, you believe it, and it's just that you're Muslim. If you compare a Muslim person that was brought up a Muslim or a revert or a convert, you see that the revert or the convert is asking more questions, and they're more likely to understand and the love of God more than people that are brought up as Muslims.
And they want to know why.
Why?
So many.
I personally, I grew up as a Muslim, but I learned the love of God.
Yeah. My parents are converts.
Yeah. So I learned the love of God. Not that we didn't have that at home and that, but it was more focused on our, practices,
the rules and regulations,
and what's haram and what's halal, and this would take you to Jahannam. The real love of God, I only learned it from really when I started to read the Qur'an tafsir and that from reverts and converts. They talk about ashqullah, the love of God, and how to love it. And when you love someone, obviously, you have husn al-zan. Right, and when you have husn zan, when someone comes and tells you something and about that, okay, the Quran or your deen says that, you're not going to lose it like that.
Which is like a good opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
A good opinion of Allah. You're going to say, this cannot happen. Number one, love leads you to the good opinion. The good opinion leads you to question that even if you just have a friend and you love her so much, you can't accept anything wrong on her. You want to investigate it further. So this is where the research starts, and this is where people want to ask more. And alhamdulillah that we have platforms like this.
Alhamdulillah, indeed. Thank you, ladies. I mean, that's riveting for me. I think we need to have a tea break. 5-minute tea break, everybody. And those online will just be out for 5 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. If you have any questions, inshallah, we'll ask them. Enjoy your break. All right, welcome back everybody. I hope you've had a nice tea break. We were too busy talking, so we didn't have anything here. We're now in the segment where we're going to ask some questions, and you're free to ask whatever question you'd like. I know we've got some people online as well that are keen to ask, and some people have submitted their questions earlier on, so when they did their registration. So what I might do is we might start with the first question being in-house. So does anybody have a question for our panelists? Yes. Oh, we've got a microphone.
I don't know if this question is completely irrelevant just because I know we're discussing the verse, but just in terms of when we did have, like, in the first part of the discussion, one hadith came to mind, and I was hoping you could sort of explain it in light of this discussion, but it was the hadith related to, forgive me if I've got this wording wrong, but something about if people could prostrate to someone other than God, I would tell women to prostrate to men. So I was wondering if you guys could provide some insight into that one.
All right, who wants to take it first?
You can start.
Oh gosh, look, all I can say is Khalid Abul Fadl has addressed this verse along with many, many other, like I mentioned, anti-women hadiths, which are, so it's a hadith, not a verse of the Qur'an. And alongside that, he talks about all kinds of awful verse, like hadiths as well, that talk about, a woman licks the pus off her husband, and that, she must stop whatever, even if she's in the middle of baking bread, to fulfill his desires. And so he has a whole book that talks about, it's called The Authoritative and the Authoritarian. And so the seeking beauty in Islam. And so his whole approach is that, look, Islam is all about beauty and about justice and about that whole, again, that reference to mawadda, rahma. But he focuses on beauty. What does beauty look like? It is beauty in your interactions with others. It is beauty in your the way that you look after and you fulfill the duties that you're supposed to fulfill. And so he addresses a lot of that, and he talks about how these hadiths have really come out as a result of some certain narrators who really were not happy with how women were, perhaps becoming a little bit more defiant. Maybe through, again, like I talked about, how even in the one country, Mecca and Medina, the two cities, there was such a different expectation and mannerisms between men and women. So you can imagine, as Islam spread and as all these different scholars came across Qur'an and hadith, and how they decided to, the context that they lived in. Also, again, I talked about the political situation, that they chose and selected certain verses. But Khalid Abul Fadl talks about how a lot of these anti-women verses are actually quite weak in their asbab, in their chains, and so
they're not the sahih type.
They're not sahih, but unfortunately some of them have been included in for various reasons. And he does talk a lot about Abu Huraira, and as I mentioned earlier, Aisha had a lot of issues with other things that Abu Huraira mentioned, and said, "Where did you come up with that?" I lived with him. I was his wife. He never, in his own actions, he didn't display that kind of abhorrence for women. And so there's a lot of subjectivity in the way in which these hadiths have been selected and included and passed on and talked about. So his book would be a really great one. He summarized it, obviously it's a bit of a decent book, but if you just want to go to that verse, to that chapter, he will go through all kinds of things. And he even talks about today with fatwas about how women who wear bras, and high heels, and so it's this continuation of this anti-woman that somehow women are out to, try and challenge the status quo, and that they should be put in their place, whereas that wasn't the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Mona, did you want to say anything about that particular hadith? I'm not sure if
not everyone agrees that this hadith is weak hadith. Mm-hmm. And for the ones that don't agree it's a weak hadith, they say there's a context for that. There's a story attached to it. I can't remember exactly what the story, but it is a beautiful story. and it came down only in that context for that person. That's for those that don't agree it's a weak hadith. But then again, there's also an author, and he's a contemporary author, Adis Tujiri. He's an academic in Queensland, Griffith University. And he's written his book, Gender in Islam, Issues and Debates. And he writes about the classical, coming from the classical period all the way to the modern in terms of hadith collection and tafsir. And it's very interesting because you can, in one book, you can see the differences, why there's differences, the critical analysis of them as well. So if you would like to refer to that.
It's good to note that sometimes the questions or the discussion is a starting point. I mean, in the hour and a half that we have, it's very difficult to canvass every aspect of the discussion. Even we were saying in the break, just the term qawamun, we could have talked the whole time about just that. So I think for everybody listening, it's important to note the references and the resources to be able to go and look into it afterwards as well, inshallah, in the hope of understanding more. Because you might not be fully satisfied tonight, right? A lot of you might have more questions. And in light of that, I guess we can go to a question online. Asma, do you have a question for us from one of the people online?
Yes, we do. The first question: if traditional scholars were influenced by patriarchy of the pre-modern period, then is it possible that contemporary scholars could be influenced by feminism of the modern period?
Excellent question. I like that one.
Yes, I did mention at the beginning there's biases, and interpretation or tafsir is the work of human. It's mankind. It's not divine. So there is interference, and then I did say the place and time. And the difference, though, is that there wasn't awareness in the classical period of the interference of ideology. However, when the translation studies and theories came in, they started, or way after translation came in, they started studying the interference of ideology, the interference of culture, the upbringing, all these interferences on the product, the translation product, the interpretation of the verse or the message, whatever it is. So obviously so you can see the classical period patriarchal ideology, contemporary there was colonization, modern and postmodern we have westernization and feminism. And this is one of the things that we see a lot in academia, especially for those women translators or commentators, Muslim women that are interpreting the Qur'an and revising these verses. They're always referred to as feminists. Now, for example, Susan Carlin did in her study, she interviewed one of them, and one of those scholars said, look, I don't have a problem being a feminist if I understand feminism the way that she understands it, as calling for the rights of Muslim women. But she did not translate the Qur'an with the mind and the intention of being a feminist, or that wasn't her motivation, the feminist movement. So there is obviously biases. There always the interference of ideology, and the ideology comes, your ideas, your views are always shaped by the culture, by the time, the place you live in, and we can see difference between translations that are translated in the West compared to the translations that are translated in the Arab world, for example. There's, in terms of time, there's not big difference, but in terms of culture, yeah.
So there's a huge element of subjectivity.
Yes.
And I guess it's just to say that, like we keep coming back to, they were products of their time. We obviously look back to them, we respect the work and the ijtihad that they did, and we don't criticize them to say, okay, they were patriarchal and therefore they intended, necessarily in all ways. It's just now, that to make life hard for women. They obviously were reflective of the society where women were looked down upon, and it just didn't occur to people at the time that women were considered to be humans, or and the Qur'an talks about how women have a soul, how women are accountable for their own deeds, and so it's this at that time, across all different religions, women were not considered to be something that was respected or considered, even generally, like to the level of being, equal in that sense. And so the Qur'an and the commentators, they had their, we all say, we know that they had their best interests at heart, that they tried to do the best that they could. And it's only because of the product of their time that now, as social norms and cultural norms change, that we will then have a look at it with fresh eyes, and it will be reflective of the products of our time. Even when I was saying like 30 years in the future, who knows how they will look at us and say, oh my gosh, they were so, like, they really didn't, the idea is the goal is justice. The goal is, for example, the beauty. The goal is rahmah. Every person who has gone through the intellectual rigor and the struggle is doing it with their own, best interest there, and they're trying to do it for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, obviously we're not judging them as individuals that they were, bad in any way. It was just a nature of the community and society and the norms that they lived in. And now the community and society and norms have changed. And so it's about trying not to be judgmental, but acknowledging that was the society, and now this is the society, and how are we going to continue further on this path of justice? It needs to be constantly reevaluated.
Interesting. So I think what you're really relaying to us is we're not trying to intention read here or dismiss the traditional scholarship, but like Mona said, we've now got, the lens of looking back, and we can actually understand the context in which those came about. But to your point, An-Nisa, if I could ask, you're saying we're going towards furthering justice. I guess if I were to play the devil's advocate, I'd be like, are we going towards justice? Is there an argument to say we're progressing away from true meaning? I guess there's an idea out there that Islam is complete. We've got the knowledge we know, and we need to now act on those commands. And there's a fear that progression or renewal might result in us steering away from what was intended. What would you say to that?
I guess I keep coming back to these examples of the modern time, polygamy and slavery, and these things existed at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. They were mentioned in the Qur'an, they were mentioned in the hadith. If we feel that, ijtihad stops and we are done, then how is it that scholars today are continuously looking at these issues and saying, okay, we need to change our attitudes and our understanding of it. It happens because life happens, societies change, people move forward. Law continuously has to adapt to changing social norms. This whole idea of the economic, who's the contributor, how do we manage, women and men now being double income? How does that affect the way in which we view harmonious, and how can we maintain and continue to support harmonious families through these changing times? I mentioned about Amina Wadud and the situation facing African American Muslims in the United States and their heritage of slavery. The Muslims back in the classical period, they saw slaves as being almost like non-humans, in the sense that you could just do with them what you wanted. And so our ideas and our concepts change, and that's just a part of the way in which we move forward as humans and as society. But having said that, if you're comfortable with a previous interpretation and translation, if you feel that suits your family, your society, your community, your situation, then by all means, nobody's saying that you have to dismiss them completely. We're saying that there now are different alternatives if perhaps that traditional classical interpretation doesn't fit with, like I said, gives you that conscientious pause. If it doesn't fit with you, and if you are at risk of maybe losing your deen or questioning everything, then there are other avenues there that you can now seek out to maintain that connection with your deen. And I think that is something that a lot of scholars are very worried about today, about young Muslims feeling that Islam is not relevant to them, feeling that Islam is outdated, and so it's about even the scholars themselves having to really try to figure out what are the needs of young people, what are the needs of the vulnerable today, women and children and widows and people who are single parents, single mothers. What are their needs? How do we make it relevant to them, and how do we support them? And so that, by all means, there's so many, the more interpretations and the more tafsirs and the more ideas, I feel are better, because everyone finds one that they feel suits them.
And there's a reality we live in, and we have to accept now as well that there is globalization. immigration. Our children and our generations are there's intermarriage relations, and if we stay in our own bubble and say, okay, my community follows this particular commentator, and then your daughter is getting married to this other person, or your son, and they come up with a problem and say, this is all I knew, because this is a reality. Or even if they don't get married, they can go online on social media and find a friend that lives in North America that's came up or raised a question about Islam in this point, and he thinks, no, this is, I've only looked at this person, this is what I've learned at home. But the more you read, the more you open up to your kids, and this is, I think, this is our role as Khalifa al-Ard. So this is our role on this earth, is to spread Islam in the right way. And another thing that raised my question is, sometimes I used to tell them, if the interpretation of the Qur'an is now influenced with feminist ideologies, because of how much we need to raise the rights of women in Islam, let's give it another 30 years. Are we going to find ourselves going to the interpretation of want to raise the rights of men? Because, when people just overdo it, and is this going to ever happen? Are we going to highlight those verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the rights of men in it? So it's, again, the time that works again thing. But if we look at really the message of the Qur'an, and we really look at the divine understanding of these, the divine message of these verses, we really don't need to, because the worldview, the Islamic worldview is not gendered. What is gendered is the Islamic discourse. That's what's gendered. And we don't have anything, even in Islamic discourse, or what I mean by that, even coming from the classical to the modern period. This is why I say I'm giving an example between feminism, or are we asking for the rights? When we come to feminism as well, we don't want it gendered. It's not about woman. It's not about man. It's about humanity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about mankind. Even the word ar-rijal is also referred sometimes to, in the Qur'an, translated as mankind. It's not referred as man, and mankind is for all, woman and man.
Lots to think about.
Yes.
Any other questions? Have we got any other questions in here? Yes. Online, have we got another one?
Okay. Okay, so this one's more based on the topic of patriarchy. Have the panelists based their approach to the verse on the premise that patriarchy is unjust? If yes, who says so? And are there evidence for it? And what makes patriarchy inherently unjust?
Wow, love it. Let's go. These guys are like, give me a minute to absorb. So I guess the premise of that question is that patriarchy could be a good thing. Right.
Okay, can I just give an example? If we look at, I'll go back, I think I mentioned Imam Ghazali because I love him. But also there's a reality there. Imam Ghazali lived in a very, very patriarchal society. And at that time, if we refer back first to the Prophet ﷺ, at the days of the Prophet ﷺ, whenever they used to go out and they had to leave their houses and their wives, the Prophet made sure that the husbands don't leave their wives more than 6 months. And there was, again, mawadda and rahma. The wives were acknowledged in any thing the man would do. At the time where the Ghazali came, or our scholars, our respectful scholars came, because they lived and grew up in that society, they just became immune to that patriarchal ideology. And when Al-Ghazali went on his trip, on his to gain knowledge, and there's a lot of stories that say he left for years and years.
Wasn't it 12 years? I read something.
Yes.
12 years.
Yes, I forgot how many years you remind. And there's even, it goes deeper, where he didn't even recognize his wife. He left and he was talking to his brother. His brother was more the person that was, he was telling him what he's going to do. It's not, so it's not because he doesn't have the rahmah in his heart. Because all his views and the fatwas he come with and the fiqh is amazing. But it's because he grew up in that society where women are disregarded. They are not to be, they're not there. And even if you look at his views and in the books, it's mainly, it's gendered. It's mainly views for men. And towards males as well. So it's a reality, and whether it's negative was the question. Do we see it as a negative
I
thing?
think the question is patriarchy negative?
Well, as I just mentioned before,
I guess,
if
is
we're
it
going to come
prophetic?
with
Is it
feminism
Islamic?
to that extreme, it's going to become to the extreme where we're not going to give the rights to men, then it's becoming negative anyway. So patriarchy in that sense, where women were deprived from even putting their names on the book. So I came across, there is The Hidden Jewels, the book for, I forgot the author's name, but the book was The Hidden Jewels. There was scholars at the time of Al-Ghazali and after Al-Ghazali, 13th, 14th, 15th century, who are women. They wrote the books, but they were actually, now we know them under male scholars. Why? Because at that time, it doesn't have to be with ill intentions. Good intentions, because at that time, the safety and security of the woman, she shouldn't be acknowledged. Her name shouldn't be showing on something that's going to go out public. So it was either anonymous or named after her brother, her uncle, etc. So obviously this deprives the woman from her rights.
I guess, yeah, just to add to that, patriarchy, I mean, it can be interpreted in so many different ways, but generally speaking, when academics and analysts and look at it, it is a situation where it can describe a community and a society and a social norm where men are the ones who are in charge, who are the ones in control, but it errs a patriarch. So you've got male-led households, and you've got situations across the world where men are the ones who are the breadwinners and the qawamun in terms of financially providing. But then patriarchy, in this sense, I think, in the way that we're talking about it, is that to that degree where women are not being entitled to the decent rights as human beings. They're being treated really disrespectfully. They don't have rights to inheritance. They don't have mobility. They don't have the ability to contribute meaningfully to the communities and to the societies that they live in a sense that they're really trying to hold and control women in a way that is not conducive to the well-being of the whole society. So in that sense, yes, I think we kind of understand that the way we use patriarchy is in a negative way, but it is talking about these situations where women are really treated unjustly. And there can be different interpretations of feminism as well, that it can, and like you said, Muslim activists sometimes associate themselves with being a feminist, sometimes don't, because these terms are very loaded. They have a lot of connotations, and they can be used and misused in lots of different ways. So I guess I hope that you could tell from our conversation that we're using the term patriarchy in the sense that it's in situations where women are being treated unjustly. And so, yes, in that situation, we feel that it is not a good thing. And it's not reflective of what the Quranic, the whole ethico-legal concept of what the Qur'an and the Prophet ﷺ set out to achieve for future generations.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. Have we got another question? 2 minutes left. All right. If we have any questions here, I will go. You do have a question. All right, let's go. Last one.
Is that okay? Just anyone else? I don't want to take the audience.
You've been chosen.
My question's more around, as you guys have mentioned, or you ladies have mentioned, around interpretations, and there's different interpretation. As a lay person or a Muslim who is not scholared, how do we orient to, like, what do we do? How do we navigate this space as someone who doesn't know much? If there's so many interpretations of this verse, what do we do?
I guess I would just go back to like that mention of the conscientious pause, and also what seems to fit with you and your context that applies to you in your immediate situation. So someone who is in a domestic violence situation will be very different from someone who is in a very amicable relationship. Someone who is a single parent will be very different to someone who lives in a multi-generational household or community where they have so much support. So if something feels that it doesn't sit right with you, and you feel that it can challenge your whole acceptance of Islam as being a religion of justice and fairness, then it's something that these alternative opinions, it's good to like look around and try to find something that does fit with you. And it can start with those who are closest to you. It can start with your friends. It can start with those that you trust, your teachers, your leaders, your mentors. Bring up these issues. I think what happens is, and I think is that because for so long we have been kind of told that we shouldn't question, we shouldn't be critical, we shouldn't ask. But even as that famous books that even the angels asked, who are we? Why can we not ask? The angels ask Allah, like, why would you choose this human being to be, the Khalifa fil ard? And the shaitan asked, how come I feel that I'm better than him? So all the creation of Allah asked, and so we continue that, and that is the scholarly tradition. You ask, you seek out, right? You inquire, you use your abilities that Allah has given us. That's what makes us different from animals, is that we don't just follow our desires blindly. We actually think about things and want to establish an environment around us that is harmonious and again just and fair to all around us.
And I think seeking knowledge is a fard in Islam, and we are rewarded for seeking knowledge. This is something in the Qur'an. It was the first verse in the Qur'an where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Iqra. So it's not to be lazy, just go out there, do your reading, do your homework, do your... when once a young girl came to me and she was going through divorce and she was on the edge of losing her deen, she's a very well-educated girl in her field, and I said to her, this is why I advise always young girls that finish your degree and go to Islamic studies. Go do an Islamic studies course, even if it's not for your degree, just for your own knowledge. Because if she had done that, I'm sure she wouldn't have been on that edge of losing her deen. She would have knew her rights. She wouldn't have allowed the imam or her husband to spiritually abuse her or physically abuse her. She would have understood the rahmah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us in the Qur'an, and she would have understood the message of the Qur'an, of the Prophet better, and therefore she would attach to her deen, not leave her deen. So knowledge is important.
Knowledge, yeah. So we've got some good tips there in terms of seeking. I think there's also an onus, speaking on behalf of the lay people, on the scholars and those in scholarship to also produce materials that we can access more easily. I mean, if you look at translations, like we said tonight, just Googling them is very difficult. Even the interpretations are quite, you do get more the traditional. So perhaps there needs to be more a push towards making accessible knowledge. And that onus falls on just not females, it falls on our scholars, our imams, all those who are in the field, so that inshallah we can access it. And I guess obviously then we can find it. But I think also reaching out from personal experience, I've had many times where I've had issues where I've grappled with and I'm like, I don't understand. You don't have to rush to an answer. You don't have to decide whether this is a matter of faith or not for you. Faith is easy. You've accepted Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So the next step for us then is just to park that issue, and over time, inshallah, when we seek clarification, we'll be able to answer it. The rush to make a decision on your faith when you come across a challenge, I think, is something that is more related to the business of our lives than anything. Yes. I think just that pause that An-Nisa mentioned so beautifully, and taking that time to come back. Our faith is a constant return, inshallah. On that note, I just want to thank our panelists for a riveting discussion. I find myself both challenged and motivated to look into what you've raised. If there are any resources that you just want to give a shout out to, can I ask each of you to mention your most favourite, book or paper that you think people can read out there on these issues?
On these issues, I've got Reem Hassan, Aisha Barlas, and I've got Dr. Hakan. He's a teacher in Charles Sturt University, Hakan Churo.
Yep.
He's spoken as well, if you want to look more about the differences of commentaries and the methodological approaches and how interpretation happens, because sometimes, you know, you're keen to find out how does this happen, why are they different. He's got a good book that he recently published.
And An-Nisa, any shout-outs to
I guess
resources?
I'd just like to just refer people, I suppose, if you don't have a lot of, if you have time, then I would recommend in this area this book by Ziba Mir Husseini and other scholars that look at specifically this idea of qawama, wilaya, you know, all these concepts that are used to create this idea that man is superior to women. But also to, I just want to highlight a project that we were involved in from a while ago, Navigate Islam. We used to hold, in this space, we used to hold the Train the Trainer course, where, for me anyway, it was quite eye-opening in you know, back in the late 1990s, okay, showing my age there, but just understanding why there's so many differences in classical fiqh, how they had so many differences, different opinions, and that still they are all considered valid. So that just, you know, that was a real eye-opener for me. So there's very short little YouTube videos up there, so just Google Navigate Islam, and there are some very nice little snippets with some of these, you know, issues that are sometimes faith-shaking, sometimes just inquisitive issues that we call him Nuruddin Lemur, Nur the Guru, to be able to, he was from Nigeria, and he came out here and was quite influential in my own life and in those around me in terms of being eye-opening, you know, to all these different opinions and just basic usul al-fiqh. So I think having that foundation in understanding usul al-fiqh really kind of like relaxes you, I think, a little bit more about, okay, oh my gosh, there's so many different opinions. How can this happen? Isn't there just one? Shouldn't we just follow one? But then as you realize that this sort of intellectual scholarship, this diversity, you know, is a rahmah, as the Prophet ﷺ said, al-ikhtilaf fi ummati rahmah, that this is something that it's an ongoing, you know, and that there was differences of opinion then, and there's differences of opinion now. There's even differences of opinion among the Sahaba, you know, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So,
and even we can refer back to, going back to Fuqaha ibn Ashur, the Tunisian scholar. He, in particular, this verse, he explains it very nicely, if anyone wants to refer to his work as well.
Thank you, ladies. If you can all just thank the ladies on my behalf. Oh, we've got a little...
So I want to thank all the ladies and both the speakers and the facilitators. This is our last session for this series. So for everyone that's joined online and who have come today and for the past two sessions, thank you so much for joining us. Inshallah, we'll be sending out hopefully feedback form. No? We'll be sending, no, we're not, sorry. But if you do have feedback, please do let us know. It's really much appreciated. So thank you so much. Can we get another? You give it to us. She already opened it anyway.
thank you so much.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a safe drive home. Good night.
Okay. Yeah.